Okay, and now we welcome Lisa Osbeck, Professor of Psychology at the University of West Georgia, who's going to talk to us about exploration and measurement in an ethnographic study of interdisciplinary science.
Thanks very much, Amy. I also like to thank ETS and Division 5. I'm very happy to be here, but as of Monday, I didn't know I was going to be doing this, so I came up with a title. I was asked to come up with a title, and I had in mind that Division 5 might be a little bit buttoned up, so I really struggled with this. So I originally sought inspiration in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, and I came up with this great little line here, which was very metaphorical for me in relation to ethnographic work, groping for trouts in a peculiar river. But then I realized, does anyone know what that's referring to? In context, always important to look at context, it's a euphemism for infidelity. So given that I didn't know the group well, I thought it might be better to stick to the original title, but this is really what I would like it to be titled because it's a great, I think, way of thinking about ethnographic work and what it entails. It's also good for thinking about the translation of insights from ethnographic work into some kind of, practical, measurable outcome, I think. So I'll walk you through an example today. So I'm going to be talking about work from a large-scale ethnographic project that was situated at Georgia Tech. This is a few years ago, but the principal investigators are in the purple and the blue. Nancy Nersessian is in the purple. She's a philosopher of science and a cognitive scientist. Wendy Neustetter in the blue is a linguistic anthropologist. And they received 2 role grants from the NSF designed to try to better understand interdisciplinary science and what works in the context of interdisciplinary science labs, what works in the sense of helping people to learn but also to innovate as much as possible. So they were charged to provide insight into the nature of interdisciplinary research, what facilitates learning and innovation in emerging fields, and then to have some kind of application to classroom design and classroom assessment. So I came in about year 4 and worked with them on a part-time basis. They called me the methods person, which is really kind of a laugh because I'm not, but as you can see, they came from the team, the larger teams. This is kind of an evolving team, so they would be here at different points in time. Nobody really had a strong background in traditional methods, so we basically had to figure it out. I'll give you an example of how we did that, but we ended up coming up with some quite interesting insights, I think, but in a kind of an unusual way of doing that. When I came in, they had gathered all of these interviews, literally hundreds of interviews, but nobody had done any analysis of the interviews. So a reason interdisciplinary research labs are important to learning scientists for a number of reasons. For one thing, there's an emphasis on understanding how different facets or aspects integrate. And so they are sites of interplay of cognitive, social, cultural, and material dimensions of creative research. And in the labs that we investigated, they were all sort of frontier or cutting-edge laboratories. They're also evolving communities, as is any community, but in this case, especially students make up a lot of the research staff, so students come and go. As they come, they bring in new problems, and new conversations happen. When they leave, those conversations change. They're also significant sites of learning, of course, because they do involve students. And philosophers like the fact that they are normatively structured contexts of practice, which means there are things, there are expectations, there are senses of ought that are very influential in those spaces. In the case of interdisciplinary science, these oughts or these norms are in negotiation because people from different backgrounds come in with different sets of norms that can influence what gets done. So we looked at 4 bioengineering labs in total. The first study looked at Lab A and Lab D here. The second study looked at systems biology. These are all different interdisciplinary configurations. Things are done a little bit differently in each one. They have different problems, different goals, different social contexts. For example, in Lab A, this was a researcher who was at the end of his career. In Lab D, the neuroengineering lab, it was a brand new principal investigator who was new to the university. That has an impact too in the kind of culture of the lab, right? But how do you start? This is the groping for trouts metaphor, right? This is what we were faced with, essentially, asked to try and figure out what people are doing. We have to try and understand even the nature of the space, what the artifacts, the devices are, let alone the concepts that are important to them and the cognitive tools that they're using to do their problem solving. So all of this is brand new. This is the peculiar river metaphor, right? We have to try and understand what all of this stuff is before we can even figure out what we're looking for. So how is another question. How do we go about figuring out how people are doing what they're doing in these very unfamiliar sites? Well, fortunately, there are some historical examples available, and we basically came up with a kind of adaptation of these. Back in the 70s, I don't know if anyone remembers this work, but there's a very interesting study by Mitrov called The Subjective Side of Science, Philosophical Inquiry into the Psychology of the Apollo Moon Scientists. And he called it A Social Psychology of Research at the time, a book about how science actually gets done. And it was based on interviews with 42 scientists associated with the lunar missions from the 60s, and it focused on specific questions about science and had a kind of personality framing too, to some extent. For example, he was interested in what the kinds of issues that are related to scientists as persons. For example, what distinguishes scientists who formulate theories from those who do not. But getting at sort of individual differences in relation to scientific reasoning, the social culture of science. So it's very interesting work, but it's back in the 70s before there was really a template for this. Very, very well-known study from sociology is Latour and Woolgar's Laboratory Life, where they really drew out the analogy to anthropology and ethnography. They went into a science laboratory as though it was a foreign culture. They used that terminology, and they tried to understand the meanings that were being enacted within that particular culture. So these are some quotes from that work. The focus of our study is the routine work carried out in one particular laboratory, very situated focus. We attach a particular importance to the collection and description of observation of scientific activity obtained in a particular setting. So the particularity was very important to this work. And this is another reason why they made the analogy to anthropology. Problem with this is they quite famously tried to black box cognition, as they called it. They were interested in understanding science as a social process and the social construction of scientific facts. So there's a kind of agenda attached to it, as you can imagine. In the 90s, Ed Hutchins and his colleagues published Cognition in the Wild, and another very important paper called How a Cockpit Remembers Its Speeds. And they developed a method called cognitive ethnography, which was based on, in some ways, Latour and Woolgar's model, but focused on trying to understand how problem solving and representations are propagated in a problem solving environment and in a problem solving system. Quite famously, they wanted to extend the idea of the processing system beyond the individual brain to the working system as a whole, the ship navigating to shore, or cockpit, the entire system of the cockpit, which includes the instrumentation, the manuals, the external representations, the history, and all of this is a kind of processing system in their view that has to be understood in order to understand how this very precise problem solving takes place. So in our case, we wanted to apply in particular the idea of cognitive ethnography to the laboratories, but in contrast to Hutchins' work, we were interested in understanding a very ill-defined problem-solving space, right? So they were looking at, landing a plane and navigating a ship. We're looking at scientific innovation, which is ongoing, which has no, really clearly defined goal, right? The goal is simply to keep pushing it forward, rather. So this required a little bit of fancy footwork, but it's as close as we could come, really, to trying to depict what it is we were trying to do. And then, of course, there was an application aspect of this. The idea is that once we understand how problem solving takes place, we might be able to bring that to classroom design and design strategies that bring students closer to emulating, mimicking what scientists actually do in these natural contexts of their practice. Okay? So the framework, just to review, this is from the distributed cognition framework that Hutchins was using, is that human cognition is both situated, cognitive activities are both afforded and constrained by properties of the environment, including the social environment and the historical context in which they occur. There's a lot of research behind this that you probably know. And also that they are distributed, again, across systems of interacting persons, artifacts, instruments, and traditions. Okay? The framework is sometimes called DCOG, or distributed cognition. The focus of the ethnographic study we took on was on, first of all, what is the social and cultural organization of each laboratory, what specific problems are they addressing, and then how are they doing it? What is the instrumentation they're using? But then also, more importantly, what are the cognitive practices? We used a practice-based framework as well. Practice implying both that there's some agency involved, right? It's not just automatic processing, but there's agency involved, and that it's a community-based phenomenon as well, right? Practice implies, to some extent, a kind of shared or cooperative meaning-making. For data collection, there are literally hundreds of interviews with scientists at every level across these 4 laboratories. There are also field observations, tours of the laboratory, a look at field-relevant literature that they cited in their work. But the interviews were really the primary focus, I would say, overall. And the interviews are of different types. Some are on their experience, kind of their social experience in the laboratory, what it's like to be part of that laboratory, what they're learning. Some of it's biographical, their own background and history leading to how they got to become a participant in the lab. Some of it's focused on specific instruments, devices, and artifacts. And some is, just focused on the problem-solving agenda of the laboratory as a whole, as well as their own individual problem-solving. We used multiple sources of data, longitudinal data, following up first with some intensive interviews and then follow-up interviews at regular intervals, field observations, both participant observation and note-taking, interviews, as I said, that were sometimes about capturing artifacts, both open and semi-structured, and then audio and visual recordings of meetings and presentations, and also some archival material collection looking at former grant proposals, PowerPoints, et cetera, that they were using, representations on whiteboards, all kinds of things. For the analysis, I can't claim to be a grounded theory expert like Heidi, so we called it grounded coding because it doesn't quite reach the level of an actual grounded theory analysis. But we coded analytically and inductively, as one would in a grounded theory study, and developed core categories from especially the interview data while we remained grounded in it. We also did case study analysis, which would be, instead of coding across participants in the laboratory, we followed individual persons and looked at their particular way of taking up problem solving and their particular goals and their particular learning trajectory in the lab. We also did case studies of instruments, for example, tools, models, et cetera. And similar to Heidi's work, we selected a subset of interviews with representatives from each lab and analyzed progressively line by line, looking for meaning units from beginning to end with the aim of providing both an initial description and then following up on it, And then we coded initially within each lab, and then eventually we looked for consistency across the 4 labs. We called it team ethnography because some ethnographies are carried out by an individual researcher, but we had a multidisciplinary team, as I mentioned, each of whom was bringing a different theoretical background, and we had regular weekly meetings when we examined the codes and tried to hammer out what was the best way of understanding what was going on. And codes then that emerged through this process were sort of tested in relation to further interviews for their applicability and their conceptual fit, and also triangulated with the field notes and additional sources of data. So our highest level codes overall were modeling. These are cognitive practice codes primarily. Modeling, framing, positioning is more of a social code, which I'll talk briefly about. Offering historical narrative. Codes relating to identity. Surprisingly, a lot of codes relating to emotion, affect, and motivation. And the motivation not so much, but the affect came out in ways we weren't really expecting at the time. Agency, norms, desires, and codes relating to managing complexity. The initial focus was not at all on counting instances, but rather on characterizing the varieties of ways in which these different phenomena appear and analyzing their function in the broader problem-solving context. So it was much more of a kind of narrative account that we were interested in offering. Here's an example. I'll give you 3 examples, actually, with different aspects of the work. Model-based cognition came out very strongly. We had codes, for example, related to model-based understanding, model-based reasoning, and then explaining in terms of models or with reference to models to the interviewer. So an idea, a concept that came out of this focus on models that we have written up into some papers was the importance of interlocking models in interdisciplinary research, which would include biological and engineering models in the wider scholarly communities and the ways those models come together to create hybrid concepts and hybrid models between the 2 disciplines. And then in the laboratories, the scientists were also working with physical models. So physical models, like a model, an artificial of a blood vessel, an artificial construct it was called, as a physical model of an actual biological process was also important in each case. And then researcher working models, we came up with different terms for this, but the idea that there's also some kind of embodied process going on for the researcher that involves typically visualization, most likely, that these things interact and interlock in every phase of problem solving in the laboratories that we examined. An interesting one that we didn't expect was a strong prevalence of anthropomorphism, especially in relation to attributing emotional states to cells. It was really quite surprising. Not just one person, this was not just even one laboratory. This was in at least 3 laboratories. There was frequent reference to cells being happy and a need for the researcher to keep the cells happy through various practices. And I've given you a few examples there. In one paper, we analyzed the function of anthropomorphism to the practice. This is something that Polanyi actually talked about in Personal Knowledge, that not only does it contribute to the motivation and interest of the researcher by imbuing the object with a bit more, imbuing the object with something that commands the researcher's interest and motivation, for example. But we also saw in the way that they were being talked about that it tended to humanize the objects in a sense, in a way that transformed them, we said, into a kind of working partnership, right? So they were partnering, we called it cognitive partnering with the cells toward new problem-solving goals and new problem-solving agendas. And a third example, again, that we were not expecting, was the importance of what we called epistemic identity. And instead of like disciplinary norms, this is sort of deeper and more sort of whole person kind of construct. It's identity in relation to epistemic tasks. So it's not so much like identity as a psychologist, for example, for us, but what do you do as a psychologist? It seems to be like a qualitative researcher perhaps has a different epistemic identity, we might say, than a primarily quantitative researcher. Not necessarily, that would need to be tested out, But these identity kinds of phenomena, these issues, these identifications with a group, we found to be extremely important. So not only the sense of oneself, but also how one sees others were affected by these disciplinary kinds of configurations. And we found then that that can be either a kind of boon to working together in interdisciplinary settings, or it can be a kind of deterrent, right? When people identify so strongly with their group and bring the norms of that group to bear, in this case, on what they consider to be good science, right? That it was actually problematic. There are other examples. This is related to what we looked at in terms of social positioning, which is a concept from discursive psychology. Okay, so the second aspect of this work, as I mentioned, was some attempt to apply this to science education, to develop recommendations for classroom design, for example, and assessment that would follow from our insights gleaned in the laboratory. And we focused on the model-based reasoning aspect of this primarily, not only because there's a lot of robust support for this in other literature, but it also obviously aligns well with other work being done on problem-based classroom design. But the questions that we really wrestled with, the other sense in which, there's a sort of groping for trouts, is this idea how we could use the insights we gleaned to specifically inform design for science education. But I think even more difficult, at least for me, is how we can evaluate the effectiveness of these designs. So we hypothesized that a certain kind of problem-based learning environment will foster model-based reasoning in beginning biomedical engineering students. And developed a course design, a system of scaffolding for teams of students, first-year students, to take on complex and importantly, open-ended problems. So they were given carefully sequenced problems. They were given scaffolding strategies for promoting a model-based approach to the problems. They were in specifically designed learning spaces with whiteboards on every side, so they were encouraged to get up and write on the whiteboards at every opportunity and to interact constantly in the course of the first-year course. And they were given writing guidelines for developing reports that are the culmination of the problem solving in each case. And they were given facilitators, faculty or postdoc facilitators for each team of 8. And there was faculty then mentoring for the facilitators. So this is the class design. Had what seemed to be some really nice results with that. But trying to evaluate that, again, is very difficult, because what we're after is trying to understand the extent to which they are thinking like engineers. So initially, we came up with questionnaires, self-report kinds of things, but we found that all we were really measuring was their understanding of what a model is. So understanding what a model is and how it functions doesn't mean they're actually thinking with and through models, right? So that's the task and that's the challenge. So our final assessment strategy was to present students with a complex problem closely linked to the kind they had in the class, and then to develop a coding system for that, which we did. 3 raters read 50 exams, final exams from the first course, and then independently developed a kind of coding system, a rubric from that effort, then coded additional exams independently and did inter-rater reliability checks, and had quite good results with a rate of agreement approximately 0.9 for the second set of exams. This was the coding system we used. We coded for the presence of a model. These are some example statements in the description of the problem being solved. The first 2 examples are more obvious. They make explicit reference to models and to making use of a model. The third one takes a bit more interpretation, and it's difficult to really distinguish, I think, in practice from just a theory-based account of this. So we were looking specifically for indications of this dynamical interactional kind of understanding, but really coding that in written work is I'm surprised we had such a high rate of agreement as we did, actually, because it was a very challenging task. We were also looking for statements that specified how a relation between variables would be tested. So we coded for test by observation, test by experiment, test by literature review. And then we looked at the order of codes for each exam. So for example, coding hypothesis, test by observation to model, right? In the example here, reflects a problem-solving strategy in which there's a proposal, the hypothesis, a test, and then a model constructed to explain the relations observed. So our view was that if students came in with a kind of received view of the scientific method, they would be likely to start with a hypothesis. But if they went through this specifically designed course, they would be more likely to try and start with a kind of rudimentary model from which a hypothesis would be derived. Okay. The problem with this, though, is there was no control group, and so we used this kind of received view as a kind of imposed control, but it had some problems, obviously, but that was the intent. Some other codes we developed, all reference to the problem-solving strategy, for example. The results were pretty high. You know, we found, again, like what this means was the problem. We found this very high rate of model use, which, again, looks great, but with no control group, it's impossible to really understand what this means. So, you know, the percentage is greater, as I said, than what we would expect given the received view, for which we would suggest we would probably try to find. We would probably look for most examples beginning the sequence of codes beginning with the hypothesis rather than the model. But we like to think, or we tried to think of this as evidence that this model-based course was helping students think like engineers. Okay, thanks. But again, you know, it sort of fell flat. It didn't go anywhere because we didn't have the control. We didn't really have anyone on board to sort of take it to the next level of developing a measure that would be useful in the context of the classroom design. We also did a similar kind of coding project in relation to laboratory notebooks that the students were keeping, looking also for evidence of thinking through and with models. And that was also some very interesting coding work, but sort of where to go with it, what to do with it was never entirely clear. So I wanted to just sort of problematize that too and maybe get ideas from you if we have time at the break where you think it would be helpful to take this as a next step for evaluating model-based reasoning in the classroom. Okay, so as a conclusion, we went from groping to trout. So with this kind of interplay of exploration and a kind of measurement application, we begin to look something more like a coordinated fishing effort, but it's still really kind of rudimentary. It's a single person, maybe metaphorically, with a bit more awareness of context and aesthetics, but it's not a coordinated fishing exhibition yet, expedition. So thanks. Oh, these are some representative publications if you're interested in any of this work.
And again, we finished in a pretty good time, so are there any questions for Lisa? Anybody want to talk about Shakespeare? Oh, I'll leave them.
Not quite a question, but I was just wondering, some of our colleagues are looking now into anthropology using the technology, and for example, getting more information about how people actually behave when they interact with a learning system or with a testing system. Have you considered, or I would assume the answer is yes, but you can comment a bit on that, the use of technology for collecting the data?
Yes, I'm not sure. The problem is what to do with it more than collecting it. I mean, we have software systems